In the upscale community of Oakwood Gardens, a devoted mother was about to hear the most devastating words any parent could imagine. What began as a joyous wedding celebration turned into a nightmare when her son publicly declared she was worthless. Eleanor Blackwell wasn't some fragile, overlooked woman. For over 3 decades, she had been a pioneering surgeon, saving countless lives while raising her family with unwavering dedication. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. When she witnessed her new daughter-in-law's genuine compassion, Eleanor had no idea she was about to make the most consequential decision of her life. What started as a cruel public humiliation would transform into an act of justice when a $350,000 college fund found its way to truly deserving hands. The string quartet's rendition of Pachelbel's Canon faded as Eleanor Blackwell adjusted her sapphire blue dress in the mirror of the country club's powder room. At 63, she still carried herself with the precision and confidence developed during her 35 years as one of the nation's leading cardiothoracic surgeons. Her silver-streaked hair was elegantly styled, her makeup understated yet flawless, appropriate for the mother of the groom at what was supposed to be the happiest day of her son's life. "You can do this," she whispered to her reflection, practicing the smile she'd perfected during decades of difficult conversations with patients' families. Today that smile felt particularly forced. For months, 1/3 of a year since Richard's funeral, since the endless procession of colleagues paying respects, former patients sharing stories, and casseroles from neighbors who didn't quite know what else to offer a widow. For months since the house had fallen silent, empty of her husband's booming laugh and passionate discussions about the latest medical journals. Eleanor checked her watch, an anniversary gift from Richard that suddenly felt heavier on her wrist. The reception speeches would begin in 20 minutes. She needed to compose herself before facing the crowd again, particularly after the strained interaction with Alexander during the pre-ceremony photographs. The bathroom door swung open, momentarily filling the space with the sounds of celebration. From the ballroom, Olivia Peterson, now Olivia Blackwell as of 3 hours ago, stood framed in the doorway, her wedding gown a vision of understated elegance. "Dr. Blackwell? Are you all right?" Olivia's voice carried genuine concern. "I noticed you slipped away after the first dance." Eleanor straightened, automatically shifting into her professional demeanor. "I'm fine, dear. Just needed a moment. And please, it's Eleanor now. We're family." Olivia stepped inside, letting the door close behind her. At 28, she possessed a quiet grace that seemed rare in her generation. A dedicated elementary school teacher with warm brown eyes and an unassuming intelligence, she had always struck Eleanor as somewhat mismatched with Alexander's driving ambition and materialistic outlook. "I wanted to check on you," Olivia said, moving to stand beside Eleanor at the mirror. "Today must be difficult." The simple acknowledgement of her grief, something Alexander had barely mentioned in the months since Richard's passing, caught Eleanor off guard. "It is," she admitted. "Richard would have loved to be here. He would have given the most thoughtful toast," Olivia said softly. "Alex showed me videos of your anniversary party last year. Your husband had such a wonderful way with words." The memory brought an unexpected smile to Eleanor's face. "He did. Never at a loss, that man. His patients adored him for it. Dr. Richard makes everything make sense, they'd say." "Alex mentions that you two met during your residency? A love story between two brilliant surgeons." "Cardiac and neuro. The heart and the brain," Eleanor's smile turned wistful. 37 years of marriage, and we never ran out of things to debate over breakfast. Olivia gently touched Eleanor's arm. "I hope we have a fraction of what you two shared." The sincerity in the young woman's voice was striking. In the 3 years she'd known Olivia, Eleanor had always appreciated her thoughtfulness, but had never truly recognized the depth of her emotional intelligence. "May I fix your necklace?" Olivia asked, gesturing to the pearl strand that had twisted slightly. "Please," Eleanor turned, allowing her new daughter-in-law to adjust the clasp. "These are beautiful," Olivia commented, her fingers carefully realigning the pearls. "My mother's," Eleanor explained. "Richard had them restrung for our 25th anniversary. I thought today was appropriate." "Perfect something old," Olivia smiled. "Thank you for being here today, Eleanor. I know it couldn't have been easy to help plan a wedding so soon after." She let the sentence trail off, but her meaning was clear. Eleanor appreciated that Olivia didn't rush to fill the silence with empty platitudes about Richard wanting them to move forward or still being there in spirit, phrases she'd heard too often in recent months. "Alex didn't want to postpone," Eleanor said simply. "And perhaps he was right. Life continues." Something flickered across Olivia's face, a momentary hesitation that made Eleanor wonder if there was more to the rushed timeline than Alexander had shared. But before she could consider it further, the bathroom door swung open again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Alexander Blackwell stood in the doorway, his 6-foot frame imposing in a tailored tuxedo that Eleanor knew had cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. At 32, her son had established himself as a rising star in corporate finance, his ambition fueled by a relentless drive that sometimes bordered on ruthlessness. "There you are," he said, his tone carrying an edge that Eleanor recognized all too well, impatience barely disguised as concern. "Mother, they're looking for you. It's almost time for the toasts." "I was just coming," Eleanor replied, noting how Alexander barely acknowledged his new wife's presence. "Well, hurry up. Uncle James is already half drunk and threatening to tell stories about my college years." He checked his platinum watch, a graduation gift from Eleanor and Richard that had cost a small fortune. "The photographer wants some shots with the sunset, and we're burning daylight." Eleanor noticed Olivia's smile falter slightly. "Of course, Alex. We'll be right there." Alexander's gaze swept over them critically. "Mother, is that the necklace you chose? I thought we discussed wearing the diamond pendant Dad gave you. It would photograph better." "The pearls were my mother's," Eleanor replied evenly. "I thought, whatever," Alexander cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Just hurry up. People are waiting." As he turned to leave, Eleanor caught Olivia's expression in the mirror, a flash of embarrassment and apology that suggested this wasn't unusual behavior from her new husband. The reception ballroom of the Oakwood Country Club gleamed with understated luxury. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over ivory linens and centerpieces of white roses and hydrangeas. 200 guests in formal attire mingled around tables. That had cost more than Eleanor thought reasonable, but Alexander had insisted on the best of everything. Eleanor took her seat at the head table, acutely aware of the empty chair beside her where Richard should have been. The wedding coordinator approached with a microphone, explaining that they would begin the toasts momentarily. Alexander was deep in conversation with his best man, Bradford Wells, their heads bent together as they examined something on Bradford's phone, likely stock prices or cryptocurrency values. Even on his wedding day, Alexander couldn't fully disconnect from work. Olivia sat beside her new husband, occasionally touching his arm when someone approached to offer congratulations, a gentle reminder of her presence that Alexander frequently seemed to overlook. Eleanor watched their interactions with a growing sense of unease. There was something performative about Alexander's affection, the way he would suddenly become attentive when certain guests approached, only to immediately return to his phone or conversations with Bradford once they moved on. "Ladies and gentlemen," the wedding coordinator announced, "we'll now hear from the mother of the groom, Dr. Eleanor Blackwell." A hush fell over the room as Eleanor rose, accepting the microphone with practiced steadiness. She'd prepared her speech carefully, wanting to honor her son while also welcoming Olivia to their family in a way that would have made Richard proud. "When Alexander was 5 years old," she began, "he came home from kindergarten and announced that he had met the girl he was going to marry." The crowd chuckled appreciatively. "Her name was Jessica, and she had shared her cookie with him at lunch. Richard and I explained that while sharing cookies was indeed a wonderful quality in a partner, he might want to wait a few years before making such declarations." More laughter rippled through the audience as Eleanor continued, weaving together memories of Alexander's childhood with reflections on the nature of partnership that she and Richard had cultivated over their decades together. "While Olivia didn't win Alexander's heart with cookies," she said, smiling toward her new daughter-in-law, "she captured it with her kindness, her dedication to her students, and her quiet strength. Richard would have adored you, Olivia." Her voice caught slightly. "He would have seen in you the same qualities that make you perfect for our son: patience, compassion, and an understanding that true success is measured not by accounts or acquisitions, but by the lives we touch and the love we share." Eleanor raised her champagne glass. "To Alexander and Olivia. May your life together be built on the foundation of mutual respect and genuine partnership that makes marriage not just endure, but thrive." The guests applauded warmly as Eleanor returned to her seat. Olivia leaned over to squeeze her hand, tears glistening in her eyes. "That was beautiful, thank you." Alexander, however, remained focused on his phone, barely acknowledging his mother's toast. It was only when Bradford stood for his best man speech that Alexander finally slipped his phone into his pocket and affected an expression of attentive interest. Bradford's speech was predictably inappropriate, filled with thinly veiled references to Alexander's wild years at Wharton and various bachelor party anecdotes that made Olivia's parents shift uncomfortably in their seats. Alexander laughed loudly, occasionally slapping the table in exaggerated amusement, while Olivia maintained a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As dinner was served, Eleanor attempted to engage her son in conversation. The ceremony was lovely, Alexander. Judge Winters did a wonderful job with the vows. Oh, yeah. Bit long-winded, but Olivia wanted the traditional stuff. He cut into his filet mignon without looking up. Brad and I were thinking of heading to the Caymans next month for some deep-sea fishing. The Harrison Group just signed a major client, and we're due for a celebration. Next month? Eleanor asked. Carefully. I thought you and Olivia were planning your honeymoon for then. Alexander waved dismissively. We pushed it back to the fall. Better weather in Bali then anyway. And I've got this massive merger happening that I can't step away from right now. I see, Eleanor said, noticing how Olivia's shoulders tensed. Slightly beside Alexander. And Olivia is okay with postponing? She understands how these things work, Alexander replied, finally glancing toward his wife with what appeared to be genuine affection. Don't you, babe? One big payday and we can upgrade from that Bali resort to a private villa. Worth the wait. Olivia nodded, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Of course. The school year is just ending anyway. Fall might be better timing. Eleanor recognized the accommodation in Olivia's voice, the subtle adjustment of her own disappointment. To align with Alexander's priorities. It was a pattern Eleanor had observed developing over their 3-year relationship, and one that reminded her uncomfortably of Alexander's relationship with his father. Richard had adored their son but had increasingly worried about Alexander's sense of entitlement and his tendency to value achievement over character. Speaking of finances, Alexander said, lowering his voice and leaning closer to Eleanor, I wanted to talk to you about Dad's life insurance policy. The executor mentioned. There might be some delay with the final distribution? Eleanor felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Since Richard's death, Alexander's inquiries about financial matters had become increasingly frequent, always couched in terms of concern for her welfare but transparently self-interested. Now isn't the time, Alexander, she replied quietly. We're celebrating your wedding. Just asking, he said, a flash of irritation crossing his face. Thought you might want help managing it all. Must be overwhelming for you. Before Eleanor could respond, the wedding coordinator announced that it was time for the father-daughter dance. The awkward moment of realization rippled through the room, there would be no mother-son dance either, with Richard gone. Eleanor had discussed this with the coordinator weeks ago, suggesting they simply skip these traditions rather than create painful reminders of absence. Alexander, however, had other ideas. He stood abruptly, tapping his knife against his champagne. Flute until the room fell silent. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice carrying the practiced charm he used in business presentations, as you know, we're missing some important people today. He gestured toward Olivia's father, who had died when she was a teenager, and then toward Eleanor. But Olivia and I didn't want to skip these special moments. So we've made an adjustment. He extended his hand toward Olivia's mother, Patricia. Mrs. Peterson, would you do me the honor of this dance? And Brad, he nodded toward his best man, has graciously agreed to stand in with my mother. A murmur of approval swept through the guests at what appeared to be a thoughtful solution. Eleanor felt her face flush with embarrassment. Alexander had never mentioned this plan to her, and from Bradford's surprised expression, it seemed he was equally unprepared. Bradford approached awkwardly, offering his hand. Dr. Blackwell? Shall we? Eleanor rose mechanically, years of social training overriding her desire to refuse this unexpected arrangement. As Bradford led her to the dance floor, she caught Olivia's concerned gaze from where she stood with her mother, who appeared equally uncomfortable with Alexander's spontaneous solution. Sorry about this, Bradford muttered as they assumed a formal dance position. Alex just told me now. Said it would look good for photos. Of course it was about appearances. Eleanor maintained her composure as they moved stiffly around the floor, Bradford occasionally stepping on her toes while Alexander performed an overly elaborate dance with Olivia's mother, clearly playing to the crowd. When the music finally ended, Eleanor thanked Bradford politely and made her way back to the head table. Alexander was already there, scrolling through his phone again. A little warning would have been nice, Alexander, she said quietly, keeping her smile in place for any watching guests. He glanced up briefly. Oh, the dance. Thought it would be a nice touch. The photographer said it would make for great album moments. Anyway, listen, I've been meaning to ask you about the lake house. Now that Dad's gone, are you planning to sell it? Because if so, I think I should have first right, Alexander, Eleanor cut him off, her patience finally wearing thin. This is your wedding day. Can we discuss family properties another time? Just being practical, he replied with a shrug. No sense getting emotional about real estate. Dad would have understood that. Your father understood the difference between celebration and transaction, Eleanor said pointedly. Something you seem to have forgotten. Alexander's expression hardened. Don't start with the comparisons, Mother. Not today. I wasn't, Eleanor began, but was interrupted by the arrival of Eleanor's sister, Catherine, who swept in with enthusiastic congratulations for the newlyweds. The evening progressed in a blur of cake cutting, bouquet tossing, and endless photography. Eleanor maintained her composed smile through it all, even as she observed Alexander's increasing intoxication and his diminishing attention toward his bride. By 11 o'clock, he was huddled with a group of his finance colleagues near the bar, loudly discussing market predictions while Olivia danced with her younger cousins. Eleanor made her way to the terrace for a moment of quiet, the summer evening. Warm enough that she didn't need a wrap. The country club grounds stretched before her, immaculately landscaped and lit with soft pathway lights. In the distance, she could hear the muffled music and laughter from the reception. Mind some company? A voice asked from behind her. Eleanor turned to find Patricia Peterson, Olivia's mother, holding 2 flutes of champagne. A kindergarten principal with a warm presence and practical outlook, Patricia had been widowed for over 15 years and had raised Olivia and her brother largely on her own. Please, Eleanor gestured to the empty chair beside her. I was just taking a short break from the festivities. Patricia handed her one of the champagne flutes and settled into the chair with a sigh. Beautiful wedding. Exhausting, but beautiful. Indeed, Eleanor agreed, taking a small sip. Olivia looks radiant. She does, Patricia nodded, her expression thoughtful. Though I admit I'm concerned about how quickly this all came together after your husband's passing. Olivia insisted Alexander needed this happiness after his loss, but she trailed off, seemingly uncertain whether to continue. But it feels rushed, Eleanor finished for her. I had the same thought. Patricia studied her champagne for a moment. Forgive me for being blunt, Eleanor, but teacher's salary and principal's pension don't afford the kind of wedding we've witnessed today. Alexander insisted on covering most expenses, which was generous, but you're wondering if there were other motivations, Eleanor said quietly. Patricia nodded, relief evident in her expression at not having to articulate her concern more directly. Olivia's always been independent. Refused my help through college, worked 3 jobs to pay for her master's degree. Her sudden willingness to accept such extravagance, it's out of character. And you're wondering if Alexander pushed for it, Eleanor concluded, pieces falling into place in her mind. I'm wondering if they're starting their marriage with the right priorities, Patricia corrected gently. Olivia's father and I had nothing when we married. Built our life dollar by dollar. There's value in that foundation. Eleanor thought of her own early years with Richard, the tiny apartment they'd shared during their residencies, the second-hand furniture, the splurge of ordering pizza after 30-hour shifts. There is, she agreed. Richard and I had similar beginnings. Different world now, I suppose, Patricia sighed. But when Alexander announced at the rehearsal dinner that he'd finally convinced Olivia to let him handle the finances because teachers shouldn't have to worry about money, I saw something in my daughter's face that concerned me. Before Eleanor could respond, the terrace door opened, and Alexander stumbled out, his bow tie undone and champagne sloshing in his glass. His face was flushed, his movements unsteady, signs that he'd had far more to drink than was wise. Mother, he said, his voice carrying too loudly in the quiet space. There you are. The coordinator's looking for you. Something about the send-off planning. Eleanor rose, setting her barely touched champagne on the small table. Thank you, Alexander. I'll find her right away. No rush, he waved dismissively, dropping heavily into the chair she'd vacated. Just thought you should know instead of hiding out here. We were just catching our breath, Patricia explained gently. It's been a wonderful celebration, Alexander. It has, he agreed, loosening his collar. Worth every penny. Speaking of which, Mother, I need to talk to you about those investment accounts Dad set up. The ones from his grandmother's estate? Now that I'm married, I think it makes sense to transfer management to me. Dad always said they were intended for my education and future anyway. Eleanor felt Patricia's gaze shift between them, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden financial discussion. Alexander, this isn't the time or place. When is, then? He pressed, leaning forward. You've been avoiding this conversation for months. First it was, too soon after Dad, then it was, let's focus on the wedding. What's next? The accounts were meant for me anyway. They were established for your education and future establishment, Eleanor corrected carefully. The balance was intended to remain under management until you turned 35, as we've discussed repeatedly. Alexander's expression darkened. That's 3 more years, Mother. I'm a married man now, a senior director at one of the top financial firms in the country. Don't you think I'm established enough to handle my own inheritance? Patricia stood quietly. I should check on Olivia. Excuse me. As she slipped away, Alexander barely seemed to notice, his attention fixed on Eleanor. Well? He demanded. Don't you trust me with what's rightfully mine? It's not about trust, Alexander, Eleanor said, maintaining her composure despite the growing tension. Your father established those terms because he believed in the value of patience and mature financial judgment. The trust vests in 3 years, as he intended. Dad's gone, Alexander said bluntly, his voice harder than Eleanor had ever heard it. Those archaic restrictions don't make sense anymore. I have opportunities now, investment possibilities. That won't wait 3 years. Property in Aspen that Brad and I could develop. A chance to buy into the firm at partner level. Eleanor studied her son's flushed face, recognizing the familiar pattern. Throughout his adult life, Alexander had presented each new financial desire as an urgent opportunity that required immediate parental support. University tuition had been followed by requests for apartment subsidies, then help with his first luxury car, then assistance with the down payment on his downtown condominium. Each time, the request was framed as an investment in his future success, each time promising it would be the last assistance needed. The terms of your father's trust are clear, Eleanor said finally. I'm not authorized to change them, even if I wanted to. Bullshit, Alexander's veneer of civility finally cracked completely. You're the primary trustee. Patricia Wells told me you have discretionary authority in exceptional circumstances. Your desire for a vacation property hardly constitutes exceptional circumstances, Eleanor replied, her doctor's training helping her maintain outward calm despite her racing heart. Alexander stood suddenly, towering over her. This is ridiculous. I'm not some child who needs his allowance managed. I have an MBA from Wharton, for Christ's sake. I manage multimillion-dollar portfolios every day. Yet you still come to your mother asking for money, Eleanor observed quietly. The truth of the statement seemed to land like a physical blow. Alexander stepped back, his expression cycling through shock, anger, and then something colder and more calculated. Is that what you think this is? He asked, his voice dropping dangerously. Poor Alexander, still begging for handouts? I think this is a pattern we established years ago, Eleanor replied, suddenly exhausted by the familiar conversation. One that your father and I enabled by always solving your financial emergencies, instead of letting you face the consequences of your choices. My choices? Alexander laughed, the sound harsh and without humor. Like choosing a career that makes more in bonuses than you and Dad saw in annual salary? Like choosing to build something instead of just cutting people open all day? Sorry. If my ambition offends your delicate sensibilities, Mother. The dismissal of her and Richard's life's work, the thousands of lives they'd saved, the research they'd published, the residents they'd trained, struck Eleanor like a slap. She drew herself up to her full height, though she still had to look up to meet her son's gaze. Your father and I supported every ambition you ever expressed, Alexander. We paid for the best schools, funded your extracurricular activities, covered your expenses through graduate school when many of your classmates were working to support themselves. We did this because we believed in your potential and wanted to give you every advantage. And now you're holding back what's rightfully mine, he shot back. Treating me like I'm not capable of managing my own inheritance. The trust will vest in 3 years, as your father intended, Eleanor repeated firmly. This discussion is over. We should return to your wedding reception. She turned to leave, but Alexander's next words stopped her cold. God, you're worthless now that Dad's gone. Eleanor froze, the cruelty of the statement stealing her breath. She turned slowly to face her son, searching his expression for any sign that the alcohol had simply loosened his tongue too far, that he didn't truly mean the vicious assessment. What she saw instead was cold calculation. Alexander stood with his arms crossed, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the expression he wore when he believed he had the upper hand in a negotiation. What did you say? Eleanor asked quietly, needing to confirm she hadn't misheard. I said you're worthless, Alexander repeated deliberately. Dad at least understood business, could see the value in strategic thinking. You've always been so caught up in your surgical god complex that you can't recognize real opportunity. Just sitting on assets, letting them stagnate because of some outdated moral principles. It's pathetic, really. Eleanor felt something shift. Inside her, a fundamental realignment of how she saw the man standing before her. Not her little boy who needed guidance, not the young adult finding his way, but a fully formed person whose character had solidified into something she barely recognized. I see, she said finally, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt in her core. Thank you for making your perspective so clear, Alexander. So you'll release the funds? He pressed, interpreting her calm as capitulation. No, Eleanor replied simply. But I will remember this conversation very clearly. Before Alexander could respond, the terrace door opened again, and Olivia appeared, her expression concerned. Alex? There you are. Everyone's looking for you. It's almost time for our send-off. Alexander's demeanor shifted instantly, the mask of the charming groom sliding back into place with practiced ease. Coming, babe. Just having a quick chat with mother about family business. He brushed past Eleanor without another glance, putting his arm around Olivia's waist as they returned to the reception. Eleanor remained on the terrace, Richard's words from one of their last conversations echoing in her mind. We've given him everything except the understanding that nothing is owed to him. I fear we failed him in the most important lesson. As the sounds of celebration continued inside, Eleanor Blackwell stood alone under the stars, confronting the possibility that her husband had been right all along. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight as Eleanor returned to her empty house, the wedding reception's forced joviality still clinging to her like perfume that had overstayed its welcome. The colonial-style home she and Richard had purchased 30 years ago felt cavernous now, each room echoing with memories rather than conversation. She moved through the darkened living room without turning on lights, navigating by memory and the faint glow of street lamps filtering through the windows. In the kitchen, she poured a glass of water and stood looking out at the garden Richard had meticulously tended. The summer roses were in full bloom, continuing their cycle of beauty with complete indifference to the absence of the man who had nurtured them for decades. Worthless. The word hung in the quiet kitchen, uglier somehow when repeated in the sanctity of her home. Eleanor had been called many things in her career: brilliant, difficult, exacting, pioneering, but never worthless. That her own son had wielded the word as a weapon, calculating its impact with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, created a wound deeper than she had anticipated. Eleanor set down her water glass and moved to Richard's study, a room she had largely avoided since his death. The space remained exactly as he had left it, medical journals stacked on the side table, reading glasses perched atop his worn leather journal, framed photographs chronicling a life of purpose and connection. She settled into his chair, the leather still somehow holding the impression of his form, and opened the bottom desk drawer where she knew he kept important documents. Among them was the trust agreement they had established for Alexander's education and future security, $350,000 carefully invested and managed, meant to provide their son with advantages they had worked tirelessly to create. The terms were clear, just as she had told Alexander. The trust would vest fully when he turned 35, a decision Richard had insisted upon after watching Alexander's spending patterns during his 20s. It's not about controlling him, Richard had explained when they finalized the agreement. It's about protecting him from himself until maturity catches up with his intelligence. Eleanor spread the documents across the desk, reading them carefully despite having reviewed them numerous times since Richard's passing. There it was, in Section 12b, the discretionary clause Alexander had mentioned. Under exceptional circumstances, the primary trustee, now Eleanor alone, could authorize early distribution if it served the beneficiary's best interests. The intercom buzzer startled her from her reading. Who would be calling at nearly 1 a.m? Eleanor moved to the entryway and pressed the response button. Yes? Dr. Blackwell? It's Olivia. I'm so sorry to disturb you this late, but could I possibly come in for a moment? Eleanor frowned in confusion. Olivia? Aren't you supposed to be at the airport? The honeymoon flight? There was a pause, then Olivia's voice again, smaller somehow. That's part of what I need to talk about. Please, it's important. Eleanor buzzed her in immediately, turning on lights and wrapping her silk robe more securely around herself as she waited by the front door. When she opened it, the sight before her was jarring, Olivia still in her wedding dress, though she'd thrown a light jacket over it, her carefully styled hair now falling loose around her shoulders, mascara smudged beneath her eyes. My goodness. Come in, Eleanor stepped aside, ushering the young woman into the foyer. What's happened? Where's Alexander? Olivia's composed demeanor, the same calm presence Eleanor had observed throughout the wedding preparations, seemed to crumble at the question. Her shoulders sagged, and tears began flowing freely down her cheeks. He's gone to Aspen, she said, the words barely audible. With Bradford and some of the others. They left right after the reception. Eleanor guided Olivia to the living room sofa, her medical training automatically assessing the young woman's state, exhausted, dehydrated, emotionally overwhelmed. I'll get you some water. Take deep breaths. When she returned with water and a cool cloth for Olivia's face, the bride had managed to collect herself somewhat, though her hands still trembled as she accepted the glass. "I'm sorry to appear like this," Olivia began, "especially after such a beautiful day. You must think I think you're a newlywed who should be on her way to her honeymoon, not sitting in her mother-in-law's living room in her wedding dress," Eleanor interrupted gently. "Please, tell me what's happened." Olivia took a steadying breath. "After the reception, when we got back to our suite, Alex was still drinking with his colleagues. I started changing, packing the last few things for our flight to Hawaii. That's when he told me the honeymoon was cancelled, not postponed like he'd said at the reception, but cancelled entirely." Eleanor felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. "Go on." "He said an investment opportunity had come up unexpectedly. Some property in Aspen that he and Bradford had been eyeing. The developers needed commitments immediately, and Alex said we couldn't pass it up." Olivia's voice remained steady, though her eyes revealed the depth of her hurt. "When I reminded him that we'd been planning this honeymoon for months, he said there would be other vacations, but chances like this don't come along every day." The familiar pattern made Eleanor's chest tighten. Alexander had always prioritized the next big opportunity, the next acquisition, the next step up the ladder of success he'd constructed in his mind. "I'm so sorry, Olivia," she said, finding the words inadequate against the young woman's obvious devastation. "I wouldn't have minded postponing," Olivia continued, twisting her new wedding band unconsciously. "It was the way he announced it, like my feelings were an inconvenience, an obstacle to his plans. And then," she faltered, clearly uncomfortable with continuing. "And then?" Eleanor prompted gently. "He said he needed money for the investment. A substantial amount, immediately. He mentioned something about a trust fund, about you refusing to release it earlier today." Olivia looked up, her expression pained. "We argued. I've never seen him so angry. He said some things, about you, about our marriage. Then he packed a bag, said he was meeting Bradford at the airport, and that I should figure out what to do with all the wedding gifts until he returned." Eleanor absorbed this information slowly, the pieces of Alexander's character forming a clearer picture with each new revelation. "And he left you alone, on your wedding night, still in your gown?" Olivia nodded, fresh tears spilling. "I didn't know where to go. My mother had already flown home. I couldn't face staying in that suite alone, with all the champagne and rose petals and expectations." She looked down at her dress, a rueful smile appearing briefly. "I must look ridiculous." "You look like someone who deserved far better than what today delivered," Eleanor said firmly, maternal protectiveness surging through her. "You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll sort things out." "I couldn't impose, it's not an imposition." Eleanor interrupted. "It's what family does. Real family," she added, the qualification feeling necessary after Alexander's behavior. She helped Olivia out of the elaborate dress, lending her comfortable pajamas and setting her up in the guest room with fresh towels and toiletries. Only when the young woman had finally fallen into exhausted sleep did Eleanor return to Richard's study, the trust documents still spread across his desk. "What would you do?" she asked the empty chair across from her, imagining Richard's thoughtful expression as he considered complex problems. "What's the right path here?" The house remained silent, offering no easy answers. Eleanor gathered the documents and returned them to the drawer, her decision not yet formed but beginning to take shape in her mind. One thing was becoming increasingly clear: the trust Richard had established for Alexander might need to serve a different purpose than they had originally intended. Morning brought a tentative knock on Eleanor's bedroom door. She had barely slept, her mind cycling through memories and possibilities, weighing options against values in the darkness. "Come in," she called, already dressed in casual slacks and a light sweater despite the early hour. Olivia appeared, looking younger in Eleanor's borrowed pajamas, her face washed clean of yesterday's makeup. "I'm sorry to bother you. I should probably go figure things out." "Have breakfast first," Eleanor insisted, leading the way downstairs to the kitchen. "Everything looks more manageable with protein and coffee." As she prepared eggs and toast, Eleanor observed Olivia surreptitiously. The young woman sat at the kitchen island, absently scrolling through her phone, her expression cycling through hurt, confusion, and resignation as she presumably read messages from Alexander. "He's still in Aspen," Olivia volunteered without prompting. "Says the investment meeting went well. They're staying through the weekend to finalize details." Eleanor set a plate before her. "And how do you feel about that?" Olivia looked up, surprise flashing across her face, perhaps at being asked her feelings rather than being told how to interpret the situation. "Honestly? Humiliated. Confused. I keep wondering if I missed signs, if I should have known." "Known what?" "That I was secondary to his ambitions, his colleagues, his lifestyle." Olivia pushed eggs around her plate. We dated for 3 years. I thought I understood his priorities, his drive. I admired it, even. But yesterday felt different. Like once the ceremony was over, once he had me, I became just another acquisition to be managed. The assessment was painfully accurate, Eleanor thought. Alexander had always treated relationships as achievements to be displayed rather than connections to be nurtured. May I ask you something personal? Eleanor ventured carefully. Olivia nodded, setting down her fork. Did Alexander push for the wedding to happen quickly after Richard's death? The timeline seemed accelerated. A flash of something, guilt, perhaps, crossed Olivia's face. He did. When your husband passed, I suggested postponing our engagement, giving your family time to grieve. Alex insisted his father would have wanted us to proceed, that life was too short to delay happiness. Eleanor nodded, pieces falling into place. And the expenses? The country club, the designer gown, the honeymoon that's now been cancelled? Alex wanted everything to be perfect. When I suggested something smaller, he said he wanted to do it right the first time. Olivia's voice carried a note of realization. I thought it was generosity. But now I wonder if it was performance. Creating an impression. For whom? Eleanor asked gently. For everyone. His colleagues, our families. Olivia hesitated. For you. The assessment rang true. Alexander had always been conscious of appearances, of how his choices would be perceived by others. The lavish wedding, coming so soon after Richard's death, had served multiple purposes, establishing Alexander as the family's new patriarch, demonstrating his financial success, creating an illusion of emotional stability and progress. What will you do now? Eleanor asked, moving their plates to the sink. Olivia's laugh held no humor. I have no idea. Go back to my apartment, I suppose. Try to understand how my wedding day turned into this. Your apartment? Not the condo you shared with Alexander? We never actually lived together, Olivia admitted. Alex kept talking about finding the perfect place after the wedding. Meanwhile, he stayed at his downtown condo, and I kept my place near the school where I teach. It seemed practical at the time. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Eleanor thought of Alexander's various residences over the years. Always luxurious, always slightly beyond his means, always requiring parental assistance with down payments or renovations. Tell me about your work, Eleanor said, changing the subject as she poured more coffee. Alexander mentioned you teach elementary school? Olivia's expression brightened for the first time since her arrival. 4th grade. At Westfield Elementary. It's in one of the city's underserved neighborhoods. The children are amazing, resilient, creative, hungry for knowledge despite the challenges many of them face at home. As Olivia described her classroom initiatives, her voice grew animated, her hands gesturing expressively. She told Eleanor about the reading program she'd developed for students who struggled with traditional approaches, about the weekend science club she ran without compensation, about the grant proposal she was writing to fund new technology for the school. It sounds fulfilling, Eleanor observed. Challenging, but meaningful. It is, Olivia agreed. Though Alexander never quite understood. He kept suggesting I look for positions at private academies, better pay, more prestige. But those children have resources already. My students at Westfield. For some of them, school is their only stable environment. Their only reliable meals. How could I leave them for a more comfortable position? The contrast between Olivia's priorities and Alexander's could not have been starker. Where he sought acquisition and status, she pursued impact and connection. Where he demanded more, she found ways to make the existing resources stretch further. You remind me of Richard, Eleanor said softly, the comparison forming in her mind with sudden clarity. He could have made 3 times his university hospital salary in private practice, but he refused to leave his research and teaching position. Money is just a tool, he always said. It's what you build with it that matters. Olivia's smile was tinged with sadness. I wish I'd had the chance to know him better. He would have adored you, Eleanor said with certainty. Not for marrying our son, but for who you are. For the values you embody. The morning passed in quiet conversation as Olivia helped Eleanor with household tasks that had fallen by the wayside during the wedding preparations. They weeded Richard's rose garden together, deadheading spent blooms and pruning where necessary. The simple physical labor seemed to provide Olivia with a needed outlet for her complicated emotions. Around noon, Eleanor's sister Catherine arrived, having texted earlier to check in after the wedding. She was startled to find Olivia in gardening clothes rather than on her honeymoon. It's a long story, Eleanor explained, leading her sister to the patio while Olivia excused herself to shower. Catherine listened in growing dismay as Eleanor recounted the previous day's events, Alexander's behavior at the reception, his cruel words on the terrace, his abandonment of his bride for an investment opportunity. That doesn't sound like the Alexander the First. No, Catherine protested weakly, though her expression suggested otherwise. Doesn't it? Eleanor asked quietly. Think about his patterns, Kath. The constant emergencies that require financial intervention. The relationships that last exactly as long as they serve his purposes. The career choices driven by status rather than satisfaction. Catherine was silent for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the garden where they had just been working. Richard worried about this, she finally admitted. During his last hospital stay, when you were arranging his medications with the nurse. He told me he feared Alexander had learned to value things over people, achievements over relationships. The confirmation of Richard's concerns settled heavily in Eleanor's chest. What did you tell him? That all young people go through phases of materialism, that Alexander would mature with time and responsibility. Catherine sighed. Richard just shook his head. Said time doesn't automatically bestow wisdom, that character has to be cultivated. Like any other valuable trait. Eleanor thought of the trust documents in Richard's desk drawer, of the discretionary clause that Alexander had tried to leverage. Had Richard anticipated this moment? Had he foreseen a situation where their son's character would be tested and found wanting? I've been enabling him, Eleanor said, the realization crystallizing into certainty. We both have. Every time we stepped in to solve his problems, every time we provided resources without requiring responsibility, we reinforced the belief that he was entitled to bailouts. He's still your son, Ellie, Catherine reminded her gently. Despite his flaws. Yes, he is, Eleanor agreed. Which is why I need to do what's best for him now, not what's easiest. When Olivia returned, freshly showered and dressed in clothes Eleanor had lent her, Catherine embraced her warmly. I'm so sorry about all this, dear. What a terrible way to start a marriage. If it even is a marriage at this point, Olivia replied, her tone measured but her eyes revealing deeper uncertainty. I've been thinking all morning. I'm not sure what we actually have together. A ceremony, yes. Legal paperwork, yes. But a partnership? A shared vision? I'm less certain by the hour. The frank assessment impressed Eleanor. Many young women in Olivia's position might cling to the fantasy of what the marriage should be, rather than confronting the reality of what it was. What are your options? Catherine asked practically. Legally? Annulment is possible, given the time frame. Olivia answered. Emotionally? That's more complicated. I committed to this relationship. Taking vows meant something to me, even if they seemed to have meant something different to Alexander. And financially? Eleanor inquired, thinking of the extravagant wedding Alexander had insisted upon. Olivia's expression grew troubled. That's where things are most difficult. The wedding expenses exceeded what we had discussed initially. Alex assured me he would handle everything, but from his texts this morning, it seems there are outstanding balances. How outstanding? Catherine asked, her tone suggesting she already anticipated the answer. Significant, Olivia admitted. The country club required only a partial deposit. The photographer, the florist, the band, all were to be paid in full after the event. Alex promised he had it covered, but now he's saying there's been a temporary cash flow issue due to the Aspen investment. Eleanor felt a familiar sinking sensation. Another financial crisis requiring parental intervention, the pattern Alexander had established repeatedly throughout his adult life. He asked if I could cover some of the vendors until he returns, Olivia continued, her voice steady despite the obvious humiliation. Use my savings or ask my mother for help. Catherine made a sound of disbelief. The sheer audacity, it's consistent, Eleanor interrupted quietly. With who he's always been, with what he truly values. Olivia looked between the two older women, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and resolve. I should go. I've imposed enough, and I need to figure out my next steps. The school year starts in 3 weeks, and I have curriculum planning, not to mention. She gestured vaguely, encompassing the complex situation of her one-day marriage. Where will you go? Eleanor asked. Back to my apartment. Start sorting through wedding gifts, I suppose. Figure out which ones need to be returned. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Catherine, a silent communication born of decades of sisterhood. Catherine nodded slightly, understanding without words. Olivia, Eleanor said carefully, before you make any decisions, there's something I'd like to discuss with you. About Alexander's trust fund, and about what constitutes exceptional circumstances for its distribution. 3 days later, Eleanor sat in Patricia Wells' office, her longtime friend and attorney reviewing the documents spread across her desk with the methodical attention that had made her one of the city's most respected estate lawyers. "You're certain about this?" Patricia asked, looking up from the paperwork. "It's an unusual approach, Eleanor. Courts generally favor blood relatives in these matters." "I'm certain," Eleanor replied. "The discretionary clause is clear: distribution can be authorized if it serves the beneficiary's best interests. I believe this does exactly that." Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying Eleanor thoughtfully. "Your definition of best interests might differ from what a judge would consider standard." "Perhaps," Eleanor acknowledged. "But Richard established this trust to help Alexander build a meaningful future. The original purpose was education and character development. I'm simply ensuring those objectives are still met, even if the path looks different than we anticipated." "Alexander will contest this," Patricia warned. "Aggressively, I imagine." "I expect he will," Eleanor agreed. "Which is why I want everything documented meticulously. Every conversation, every text message, every witness statement regarding his behavior at the wedding and after." Patricia made notes on her legal pad. "And Olivia? Is she comfortable with her role in this?" "She's processing a great deal right now," Eleanor said carefully. "The annulment papers have been filed. She's returned to her apartment and is sorting through what remains of the wedding aftermath. But she understands the purpose of what I'm proposing, and she supports the underlying principles." "Which are?" Eleanor considered the question thoughtfully. "That consequences matter. That character is revealed through choices. That genuine growth sometimes requires facing the results of our actions without rescue." Patricia nodded slowly, beginning to gather the documents. "I'll prepare everything as you've requested. The initial transfer can be processed by the end of the week, with the remaining disbursements structured according to your specifications." As Eleanor left the attorney's office, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, not the burden of decision, which remained heavy, but the oppression of continued enabling. For 32 years, she had sought to protect Alexander from difficulty, to smooth his path toward success. In doing so, she realized, she had denied him the opportunity to develop resilience, accountability, and genuine empathy. "That ends today," she murmured to herself as she drove toward Westfield Elementary School, where Olivia had asked to meet her during her lunch break. The school was located in a neighborhood that had seen better days: modest homes with chain link fences, corner stores with security bars, playgrounds showing signs of deferred maintenance. Olivia was waiting in her classroom, a cheerful space despite the building's age, with student artwork covering the walls and bookshelves overflowing with well-loved volumes. She looked more like herself today, dressed in casual summer clothes, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. "Thank you for coming," she said, offering Eleanor a chair at one of the student desks. "I wanted you to see this place, to understand what matters to me." Eleanor looked around the classroom, noting the careful organization, the educational posters made by hand rather than purchased, the reading corner with cushions that had been lovingly repaired rather than replaced. "It's a wonderful space," she said sincerely. "You've created something special here." "With limited resources," Olivia acknowledged. "But that's part of the lesson, isn't it? Working with what you have, finding creative solutions, valuing effort over expenditure." The observation struck Eleanor as precisely the lesson Alexander had never learned: the value of limitations. The growth that comes from overcoming genuine obstacles rather than circumventing them through privilege. "Patricia is preparing the documents," Eleanor said, turning to the purpose of their meeting. "The first disbursement can be transferred by Friday." Olivia nodded, her expression serious. "I've been thinking about our conversation. About using the trust for its intended purpose, even if not its intended recipient." "And?" Eleanor prompted. Gently. "I'm still processing," Olivia admitted. "It's a tremendous responsibility. But I keep thinking about what you said, about honoring values rather than simply fulfilling expectations. About teaching through actions rather than words." Eleanor reached across the small desk to squeeze Olivia's hand briefly. "You don't have to decide everything today. The framework we've discussed allows for flexibility, for evolution as circumstances change." Olivia smiled, the expression reaching her eyes for the first time since the wedding. "That's what good teachers do, isn't it? Provide structure while allowing room for growth." As they left the classroom, Eleanor paused to examine the bulletin board outside, where student projects on community heroes were displayed. Among the expected firefighters and police officers were more surprising choices: the crossing guard who knew every child's name, the librarian who stayed late to help with homework, the cafeteria worker who slipped extra food into backpacks. "On Fridays, they understand what matters," Olivia said softly, following Eleanor's gaze. before anyone teaches them otherwise. The observation settled in Eleanor's chest with surprising weight. She thought of Alexander as a child, curious, bright, full of potential, and wondered at what point materialistic values had overtaken the empathy and connection they had tried to instill. Perhaps this decision was too late for her son, she reflected as she drove home. Perhaps his character was already formed, his priorities fixed by years of reinforcement. But as Richard had often quoted from his medical training, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. Eleanor was planting now, cultivating what values she could, even if the garden looked different than she had once imagined. The first sign that news had reached Alexander came in the form of 17 missed calls and a barrage of text messages, each more demanding than the last. Eleanor reviewed them from the tranquility of Richard's study, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the antique desk where she'd made her decision 3 days earlier. Call me immediately. What the hell do you think you're doing? This is my money we're talking about. Answer your phone or I'm coming over. The progression was predictable: shock, outrage, entitlement, and finally, threats. Eleanor set her phone aside and returned to organizing Richard's medical journals. She had begun the process of cataloging his extensive collection, separating volumes to be donated to the university hospital's library from those containing his personal research notes. The doorbell rang at precisely 6:14 p.m., followed immediately by aggressive knocking. Eleanor moved unhurriedly to answer it, knowing exactly who she would find on her doorstep. When she opened the door, Alexander stood with his fist raised to continue pounding, his normally immaculate appearance notably disheveled. How could you do this? He demanded without preamble, pushing past her into the foyer. My trust fund? To Olivia? Have you completely lost your mind? Eleanor closed the door calmly. Hello, Alexander. I see you've spoken with Patricia. Don't patronize me, he snapped, pacing the entryway like a caged animal. She called me into her office this morning, showed me the transfer documentation. $350,000, my inheritance, being handed over to a woman I'm in the process of divorcing. It's insanity. It's probably illegal. It's neither, Eleanor replied evenly. The discretionary clause in your father's trust agreement gives me complete authority to determine exceptional circumstances warranting early distribution. I've determined that these circumstances qualify. Alexander stopped pacing, his expression calculating beneath the anger. This is about what I said at the wedding, isn't it? One comment made under stress and champagne, and you're punishing me by giving away my birthright? This isn't punishment, Alexander, Eleanor said, moving toward the living room and gesturing for him to follow. It's consequence. And it's not about one comment, it's about a pattern of behavior that your father and I enabled for far too long. He remained standing as she took a seat, towering over her in what she recognized as a deliberate attempt at intimidation. So what? This is some twisted form of tough love. Stealing my inheritance to teach me a lesson? Nothing has been stolen, Eleanor corrected. The trust was established for educational purposes and future development. That's precisely how it's being used. By giving it to Olivia? Alexander's laugh was harsh, disbelieving. The elementary school teacher who couldn't even handle being married to me for 24 hours? Eleanor studied her son's face, noting the complete absence of self-reflection in his assessment. Olivia has filed for annulment because you abandoned her on your wedding night to pursue a real estate opportunity. You left her alone with thousands of dollars in unpaid vendor bills and expectations that she would solve the problems you created. That's not her failing to handle the marriage, Alexander. That's you failing to understand what marriage means. The truth of the statement seemed to bounce off him without impact. Whatever spin you want to put on it, the result is the same. You've taken my inheritance, money Dad specifically set aside for me, and handed it to someone who's essentially a stranger. Is that how you see Olivia? After 3 years together, after exchanging vows before 200 guests? As a stranger? Alexander's expression shifted into something harder, more calculating. What I see is that my own mother has betrayed me. Chosen someone else over her own son. The question is why? Eleanor sighed deeply. This was the heart of it, Alexander's fundamental inability to see beyond his own interests, to recognize that others' needs and values might legitimately take precedence over his desires. I haven't chosen anyone over you, she said quietly. I've chosen to honor the purpose of the trust your father established, rather than simply following the letter of its original designation. The money was intended to build something meaningful, to support education and growth. That's exactly what it will do now. And what am I supposed to do about Aspen? Alexander demanded, his priorities revealing themselves without subtlety. Bradford and I are on the hook for the initial investment. I told them my funds would be available this week. You'll need to find another solution, Eleanor replied simply. Perhaps scale back your ambitions to match your actual resources, rather than the ones you anticipated claiming from others. Alexander stared at her as if she had suggested he grow wings and fly. The concept of limiting his aspirations to his actual means appeared genuinely foreign to him. This isn't over, he said finally, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. You've made a serious mistake, Mother. One that will have consequences for both of us. I've considered the consequences. Very carefully, Eleanor assured him. For everyone involved. As Alexander stormed out, slamming the door with enough force to rattle the photographs in the hallway, Eleanor remained seated, feeling a strange combination of sadness and resolution. The confrontation had gone exactly as she'd anticipated. Alexander focusing entirely on what he perceived as loss, with no recognition of the deeper principles at stake. She picked up her phone and texted Catherine, he came by. As expected. I'm fine. Her sister's reply was immediate, want me to come over? I make a mean martini for post-Alexander recovery. Eleanor smiled despite the heaviness in her chest. Not tonight. Processing. Talk tomorrow. She moved to the window, watching as Alexander's luxury sedan peeled out of the driveway, leaving black marks on the pavement, a small but telling detail that emphasized his disregard for anything beyond his immediate feelings. The trust transfer wasn't about punishing him, despite his perception. It was about finally allowing the natural consequences of his choices to unfold without rescue or buffer. The following morning brought a more unexpected visitor. Eleanor was tending Richard's roses, the early August heat already building despite the hour, when a car she didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. Bradford Wells emerged, looking uncomfortable in his business casual attire, as if making a house call to his friend's mother existed entirely outside his normal experience. Dr. Blackwell, he called, approaching the garden hesitantly. I hope I'm not intruding. Eleanor straightened, removing her gardening gloves. Bradford. This is a surprise. He shifted awkwardly, glancing around as if expecting Alexander to appear. I wanted to speak with you privately. About the Aspen situation. And other things. She gestured toward the garden bench beneath the oak tree. Would you like some iced tea? It's already sweltering out here. That would be great, actually. Thank you. Once they were settled in the shade with cold drinks, Bradford seemed to struggle with how to begin. Up close, Eleanor could see signs of strain around his eyes, the same intensity she observed in many of Richard's younger colleagues when they pushed themselves too hard for too long. Alexander is furious, Bradford said finally, stating the obvious. He's been calling attorneys, looking into ways to challenge the trust transfer. I thought you should know. I expected as much, Eleanor replied. Patricia warned me he would contest the decision. Bradford nodded, staring into his tea as if it might offer guidance. The thing is, the Aspen investment. It's not what Alex has been describing to you. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. He told you it was a property development opportunity, right? Something solid, with guaranteed returns? Bradford's voice carried a note of hesitation. It's actually a lot more speculative than that. The property exists, but the development plan hinges on rezoning that hasn't been approved yet. The current investors are looking to offload their stakes before the county commission votes next month. The revelation wasn't entirely surprising, given Alexander's history of presenting opportunities in the most favorable light possible. And you're involved in this venture as well? Bradford winced visibly. I put in $20,000, my portion of our agreed investment. Alex was supposed to contribute 3 times that amount. He told me your husband's trust was being released to him this week. Did he mention that the trust wasn't scheduled to vest for another 3 years? Eleanor asked mildly. No, Bradford admitted, looking increasingly uncomfortable. He said it was a done deal, just some paperwork to finalize. That's why we went to Aspen, to secure our position before the current investors could find other buyers. Eleanor considered Bradford thoughtfully. He had been Alexander's friend since business school, always slightly in her son's shadow, following his lead in both professional and social contexts. She had sometimes wondered if Bradford served more as an enabler than a genuine friend, reinforcing Alexander's worst impulses rather than providing counterbalance. Why are you telling me this, Bradford? She asked directly. He set down his glass, meeting her gaze with surprising frankness. Because I'm starting to think Alex isn't the financial genius I've been following for the past decade. Because this Aspen deal isn't the first questionable investment he's dragged me into. And because he hesitated, seeming to weigh his words carefully, what he did to Olivia at the wedding was wrong. Really wrong. The admission seemed to cost Bradford something, as if acknowledging his friend's flaws somehow diminished his own judgment. I should have said something when he announced he was skipping the honeymoon. Should have refused to go to Aspen. But I didn't. I just followed along like always. Eleanor felt a spark of hope at this evidence of moral reflection, something she had seen precious little of in Alexander's circle of friends and colleagues. It's never too late to recalibrate your compass, she said gently. Richard used to tell his residents that the most important skill in medicine wasn't technical proficiency or even diagnostic acumen, it was the willingness to recognize when you're headed down the wrong path and course correct before causing harm. Bradford nodded slowly. That's why I came, I guess. To course correct. Alex is talking about leveraging everything he has to fight this trust transfer, taking out loans, putting his condo up as collateral. He's convinced himself it's about the principal, about what's rightfully his, but it's really about maintaining the illusion of success he's constructed, Eleanor finished. About avoiding the reckoning that comes when appearances can no longer be sustained by reality. Yeah, Bradford agreed quietly. That sounds about right. As Bradford prepared to leave, he paused awkwardly by his car. Dr. Blackwell? For what it's worth, I think what you're doing takes real courage. Standing up to Alex isn't easy, I should know. A rueful smile crossed his face. He's always been the one with the grand vision, the big plans. The rest of us just orbit around him, hoping some of that confidence rubs off. Confidence and character aren't the same thing, Eleanor observed. Though they're often confused. I'm starting to understand that, Bradford replied. Better late than never, I guess. As his car disappeared down the driveway, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the unexpected conversation. Perhaps the ripple effects of her decision would extend beyond Alexander himself, causing others in his orbit to reconsider their own choices and allegiances. The thought brought a measure of satisfaction, not vindictive pleasure in Alexander's difficulties, but hope that meaningful growth might emerge from this necessary disruption. That afternoon, Eleanor met Olivia at Patricia's office to finalize the trust transfer documentation. The young woman had recovered some of her natural composure in the week since the wedding debacle, though shadows of exhaustion remained beneath her eyes. Alexander came to see me yesterday, Olivia said as they waited in the tastefully appointed conference room. He was not at his best. Eleanor could imagine the scene all too vividly. I'm sorry. I should have warned you he might make contact once he learned about the trust. It's all right, Olivia assured her. I've been teaching fourth graders for 6 years. I can handle a tantrum, even an adult-sized one. The observation drew an unexpected laugh from Eleanor. What did he want? To convince me to decline the trust transfer, Olivia replied. He started with charm, said there had been a misunderstanding. That he'd been under tremendous pressure, that we could work things out if I'd just give him time. When that didn't work, he switched to intimidation, legal threats, hints about ruining my reputation at school, suggestions that no one would believe I hadn't manipulated you into this decision. Eleanor felt a surge of protective anger. That's outrageous. And completely unsurprising, unfortunately. What did surprise me, Olivia continued thoughtfully, was how quickly I recognized the pattern. 3 years together, and I somehow missed that this is his default approach, charm, then pressure, then threats. It was so obvious yesterday, like watching a script unfold. It's harder to see clearly when you're emotionally invested, Eleanor said gently. Richard and I missed it for decades, despite all our training in objective observation. Patricia entered the conference room with a portfolio of documents, her professional demeanor firmly in place. Ladies, we're ready to proceed. I've prepared everything according to our discussions, with the disbursement schedule as outlined. The 3 women reviewed the paperwork methodically, with Patricia explaining each provision in clear, precise terms. The trust would be transferred in its entirety to Olivia, but with specific conditions governing its use, conditions that reflected both Richard's original intentions and Eleanor's evolving understanding of what constituted genuine benefit. The first portion will be released immediately, Patricia explained, pointing to the relevant section. $100,000 for the establishment of the Richard Blackwell Memorial Scholarship Fund at Westfield Elementary, providing educational enrichment opportunities for students demonstrating both academic promise and community engagement. Olivia nodded, her expression solemn with the responsibility. I've already spoken with Principal Martinez about the logistics. The school board is prepared to establish an independent committee to oversee the scholarship selections, ensuring transparency and fairness. Patricia continued, the second disbursement of $100,000 will follow in January, designated for the expansion of Westfield's STEM program, including laboratory equipment, technology resources, and specialized teacher training. The timing works perfectly with the district's budget cycle, Olivia added. We can leverage these funds to qualify for matching grants from the State Educational Foundation. And the final disbursement of $150,000, Patricia concluded, will be held in trust for an additional year, then released for the establishment of the Blackwell Teaching Fellowship, providing salary supplements for exceptional educators who commit to serving in under-resourced schools for a minimum of 3 years. Eleanor felt a profound sense of rightness as she signed the authorization documents. The trust Richard had established would indeed serve its intended purpose, supporting education, encouraging excellence, and building something of lasting value. The beneficiary might be different than originally planned, but the underlying principles remained intact. There's one more document, Patricia said, sliding a final paper across the table. Alexander has formally contested the transfer. This acknowledges that you've been notified of his petition to the court. Eleanor accepted the notice without surprise. What are his grounds? The usual, Patricia replied with professional detachment. Claims of undue influence, temporary mental impairment due to grief, manipulation by a third party. Nothing we didn't anticipate. And our position? Olivia asked quietly. Remains strong, Patricia assured her. The discretionary clause in the original trust agreement is quite clear. As primary trustee, Dr. Blackwell has full authority to determine qualifying circumstances for early distribution. Alexander's own behavior, documented in multiple witness statements from the wedding and subsequent communications, provides ample justification for redirecting the funds toward more responsible uses. Eleanor studied the legal notice, finding herself strangely unmoved by Alexander's attempt to reclaim what he viewed as rightfully his. She had expected this fight, had prepared for it mentally and emotionally. What she hadn't anticipated was the sense of peace that accompanied her decision, the certainty that, for perhaps the first time in decades, she was responding to Alexander as the person he truly was, rather than the son she had wished him to be. He'll make this as difficult as possible, she observed, passing the notice back to Patricia. Undoubtedly, the attorney agreed. But difficulty and success aren't the same thing. His legal position is weak, even with expensive representation. As they left Patricia's office, Olivia paused on the sidewalk, her expression thoughtful. In the late afternoon light. Would you have time for an early dinner? There's something I'd like to discuss with you. They settled at a small Italian restaurant nearby, ordering pasta and sharing a bottle of Chianti that reminded Eleanor of the sabbatical she and Richard had taken in Tuscany 15 years earlier. I've been thinking about legacy, Olivia said, after they had eaten in comfortable silence for several minutes. About what we leave behind, what truly lasts. Eleanor nodded encouragingly, curious where this reflection was leading. When I was clearing out my things from Alex's condo, I found a photograph I'd never seen before, Olivia continued. You and your husband, much younger, standing in front of what looked like a clinic in a developing country. Uganda, Eleanor supplied, the memory surfacing immediately. 1992, Richard and I spent 6 months there with Doctors Without Borders, establishing a cardiac care unit at a regional hospital. It was before Alexander was born. You both looked so purposeful, Olivia observed. Not just happy, though you clearly were, but driven by something meaningful. Eleanor smiled at the assessment. We were. Those months changed our perspectives permanently. When we returned to the States, Richard shifted his research focus to developing low-cost surgical techniques that could be implemented in resource-limited settings. My practice evolved to include annual volunteer surgical missions. The experience shaped everything that followed. That's the kind of legacy I want to build, Olivia said with quiet determination. Not just teaching in my classroom, but creating systems that expand opportunities for students like mine, regardless of their circumstances. Eleanor recognized the spark in the young woman's eyes, the same purposeful intensity she had seen in Richard when he discovered a research direction that aligned perfectly with his values. The trust will help make that possible, she said, refilling their wine glasses. But the vision driving it, that comes from you. And from you, Olivia added softly. This path wouldn't exist without your courage in redirecting resources toward their highest purpose. The acknowledgement touched Eleanor deeply. She had expected her decision to create conflict, had prepared for Alexander's anger and potential litigation. What she hadn't anticipated was this unexpected connection, this shared commitment to principles that transcended individual benefit. To purposeful legacies, she said, raising her glass in a toast. To choosing meaning over expectation, Olivia responded, her eyes bright with conviction. As they finished their meal, discussing potential partnerships between the hospital where Eleanor still consulted and Westfield's developing health sciences program, Eleanor felt something shift within her, grief making space for new purpose, loss transforming gradually into possibility. Alexander's cruelty at the wedding had been intended to diminish her, to reduce her to a resource whose value was measured solely by what she could provide him. Instead, it had catalyzed a reckoning long overdue, forcing her to examine the patterns of enabling she had perpetuated for decades. Worthless, he had called her. But worth wasn't determined by one person's limited assessment. True value emerged from alignment between actions and principles, from choices that honored deeper truths rather than superficial expectations. As she drove home through the gathering twilight, Eleanor found herself looking forward rather than backward, not past Alexander, whose challenges remained significant, but beyond the narrowly defined role she had occupied for so long. Mother, widow, surgeon, these identities remained. But something new was emerging alongside them, something that felt surprisingly like freedom. 6 months later, the Westfield Elementary auditorium hummed with anticipation. Parents, teachers, and community members filled every available seat, while excited fourth graders fidgeted in the front rows, their science projects displayed prominently on tables lining the walls. A banner stretched across the stage, First Annual Richard Blackwell Memorial Science Symposium. Eleanor stood at the back of the room, observing the scene with quiet satisfaction. The transformation of Westfield over the past half-year had been remarkable, not just in physical improvements like the newly equipped science laboratory and computer center, but in the palpable sense of possibility that now permeated the school. Quite a turnout, said a voice beside her. Eleanor turned to find Catherine, elegant in a simple blue dress, surveying the crowd with approval. Richard would have loved this. He would, Eleanor agreed, her throat tightening unexpectedly. Especially the hands-on experiments. He always said you couldn't truly understand science until you'd made a proper mess. Catherine laughed, linking her arm through her sister's. Remember his kitchen chemistry sets? Mother nearly had a heart attack when he created that foam explosion that reached the ceiling. And then Dad made him explain the exact chemical reaction before helping clean it up, Eleanor recalled, smiling at the memory. Richard could recite that formula decades later. They found their seats as Principal Martinez approached the podium. Her normally stern demeanor softened by evident pride in the evening's event. Welcome, Westfield families and honored guests, she began, her voice carrying authority without amplification. Challenge them to solve problems that affect their communities, and they'll exceed every benchmark we establish. Bradford nodded, seeming to absorb this perspective. I've been rethinking a lot lately. Priorities. Measures of success. What constitutes a worthwhile investment? And what have you concluded? Eleanor asked, genuinely interested in his evolution. That I've been using the wrong metrics, he admitted. Chasing returns that can be quantified in spreadsheets while ignoring the ones that matter in actual lives. It's humbling to realize how much time I've wasted. Before Eleanor could respond, Olivia approached, her face flushed with the success of the evening. Bradford, you made it. Have you had a chance to meet any of the students? Not yet, he replied. Though I was particularly impressed by the water filtration project. Marisol, Olivia nodded. Come on, I'll introduce you. She's actually incorporating some basic business concepts into her next phase, cost analysis, scalability factors. Right up your alley. As they moved toward Marisol's exhibit, Eleanor found herself watching their interaction with interest. Bradford had mentioned running into Olivia last week, suggesting more contact than she had been aware of. The ease between them spoke of developing friendship rather than awkward connection through Alexander. Catherine rejoined Eleanor, following her gaze. Well, that's an interesting development. Indeed, Eleanor agreed. Though not entirely surprising, perhaps. They're both re-evaluating their paths. Speaking of which, Catherine said more quietly, have you heard anything from Alexander recently? Eleanor sighed, the evenings. Positive energy temporarily dimmed. His lawyer continues to file motions contesting the trust transfer. Patricia says it's largely procedural at this point, delays and objections without substantive legal merit. The courts have consistently upheld my discretionary authority. And personally? Catherine pressed gently. Any direct contact? Christmas card, Eleanor replied. Pre-printed, with a generic signature. No return address, though the postmark was Aspen. Catherine's expression registered concern. How do you feel about that? Eleanor considered the question carefully, watching as Bradford leaned in to listen attentively to Marisol's explanation of her filtration system's mechanics. I feel at peace with it, she said finally. Not happy, certainly. I wish things were different. But I recognize that Alexander needs to find his own way through this, without me clearing his path or softening the consequences of his choices. That's remarkably healthy, Catherine observed. Richard would be proud of your clarity. Richard saw this coming long before I did, Eleanor admitted. He recognized the patterns I was reluctant to acknowledge. The trust transfer is honoring his foresight as much as implementing mine. Later that evening, as the event wound down, Eleanor found herself helping Olivia and several teachers dismantle displays and rearrange the auditorium for the next day's classes. The manual labor felt satisfying after the emotional intensity of the symposium, simple tasks with immediate results, requiring no complex ethical calculations or psychological navigation. Dr. Blackwell, Principal Martinez approached, clipboard in hand as always. The school board members were impressed with tonight's presentations. They've requested a formal proposal for expanding the STEM initiative to other elementary schools in the district. That's wonderful news, Eleanor replied. Exactly the kind of multiplication effect we were hoping for. Martinez nodded briskly. Olivia's already drafted an outline for scaling the program. The woman is tireless, teaching full-time, coordinating this initiative, and now I hear she's enrolled in the Education Policy Master's program at State. Eleanor glanced across the room where Olivia was engaged in animated conversation with Bradford and Catherine, her hands gesturing expressively as she explained something that had them both nodding with interest. She's found her purpose, Eleanor observed. That kind of clarity generates its own energy. Indeed, Martinez agreed, her professional demeanor softening slightly. The trust fund could have simply provided resources. But what you've both created here is a framework for sustainable change. That's considerably more valuable. As the last displays were packed away and the lights dimmed, Eleanor found herself walking to the parking lot with Bradford, who had stayed to help with the cleanup despite his designer suit and apparent unfamiliarity with folding cafeteria tables. I wanted to tell you something, he said as they reached her car. About Alexander. Eleanor tensed slightly, preparing herself for whatever update might follow. The Aspen investment collapsed last month, Bradford continued. The county commission denied the rezoning request. The property value dropped by 60% overnight. I'm sorry to hear that, Eleanor said sincerely. I never wished for Alexander to fail. I know, Bradford nodded. That's actually why I wanted to speak with you. Alex is convinced you redirected the trust specifically to punish him, that you wanted to see him struggle. I tried explaining that wasn't the case, but he's entrenched in his perspective. Eleanor wasn't surprised by this assessment. Alexander had always interpreted others' actions through the lens of his own motivations, assuming they operated from the same self-interested calculations that drove his decision-making. The interesting thing is, Bradford continued, watching the trust funds being used here, at Westfield, it's clarified something for me. This isn't about withholding resources from Alex. It's about directing them toward their highest purpose. The insight struck Eleanor as remarkably perceptive, especially coming from someone who had spent years in Alexander's orbit, absorbing his values and priorities. That's exactly right, she confirmed. The trust transfer wasn't punitive. It was purposeful. Bradford leaned against his car, his expression thoughtful in the parking lot's harsh lighting. I've been offering to help Alex restructure his finances, find a sustainable path forward. So far he's refused. Says he'll bounce back, bigger than ever, once he forces the courts to reverse the trust transfer. That sounds like Alexander, Eleanor acknowledged. He's always believed that rules and constraints apply differently to him than to others. I used to admire that confidence, Bradford admitted. Now I recognize it as something else entirely. They parted with a handshake that felt significant, not just a social formality but recognition of shared understanding that had evolved over the past months. Eleanor drove home through quiet streets, reflecting on the evening's events and the unexpected connections forming in the wake of her difficult decision. The house was dark when she arrived, but not unwelcoming. In the months since Richard's death, she had gradually reclaimed the space, making subtle changes that acknowledged his absence while affirming her continuing presence. His medical journals remained in the study, but her own books now joined them on the shelves. His favorite chair still occupied its place by the window, but she no longer avoided sitting in it, finding comfort rather than pain in the connection. Eleanor made tea and carried it to the back porch, where the February night was unusually mild. Stars punctuated the clear sky, and somewhere in the distance, wind chimes created a gentle melody. She thought about the children she had met that evening, bright, curious minds newly awakened to possibilities they hadn't previously imagined for themselves. Marisol with her water filtration system, dreaming of helping communities like her grandparents' village in Guatemala. Jamal with his urban garden design, determined to address food deserts in his neighborhood. Destiny with her alternative energy demonstration, explaining solemnly that her family's electricity had been shut off 3 times last year, so she wanted to create power sources that wouldn't depend on monthly bills. These children were the true beneficiaries of Richard's trust, not receiving funds directly, but gaining access to opportunities that would expand their horizons permanently. The financial resources would eventually be depleted, but the impact would continue multiplying through lives changed and potential unlocked. Eleanor's phone chimed with a text message from Olivia. Can't stop smiling. The kids were amazing tonight. Coffee tomorrow to discuss expansion proposal? She typed a quick affirmative response, then noticed a second message, this one from Bradford. Thank you for including me tonight. Perspective shifting in the best possible way. The unexpected connection between these two people, both finding their way forward after Alexander's destructive impact on their lives, gave Eleanor a sense of hope she hadn't anticipated. New relationships were forming, new possibilities emerging from what had initially seemed like endings. The doorbell's unexpected ring broke through her reflections. Eleanor glanced at her watch, nearly 11, far too late for social calls. She moved cautiously to the entryway, peering through the sidelight before opening the door. Alexander stood on the porch, his appearance startling in its dishevelment. His designer clothes were rumpled, his normally perfect hair unkempt, dark circles shadowing his eyes. He swayed slightly, suggesting either exhaustion or intoxication, possibly both. Alexander, Eleanor said carefully, not opening the door. Fully. It's very late. I saw the lights, he replied, his voice hoarse. Knew you'd be up. Always were a night owl. Like Dad. What I want doesn't seem to matter much anymore. Everything's falling apart. The Aspen deal. The firm's quarterly review. Even my condo association's threatening eviction over missed fees. Eleanor studied her son's face, noting the genuine distress beneath the self-pity. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Alexander was facing consequences he couldn't charm or manipulate his way out of. I'm sorry you're struggling, she said sincerely. But showing up at midnight won't solve your problems. Alexander faltered, seeming to search for words that didn't come naturally to him. I thought we could talk. About the trust. About finding some compromise. It was the approach Eleanor had expected eventually, not genuine recognition of his patterns, but strategic concession when other avenues had been exhausted. Alexander had always been willing to temporarily adjust his tactics when necessary to achieve his ultimate goal. There's no compromise to be reached, she replied gently but firmly. The trust transfer is complete and legally binding. The funds are already being utilized for their designated purposes. Alexander's expression hardened, the vulnerability replaced by familiar calculation. So that's it? You've written me off completely? Your only son? I haven't written you off, Alexander, Eleanor corrected. I've simply stopped enabling behavior that diminishes rather than develops your character. There's a significant difference. Character, he repeated, the word dripping with derision. You sound exactly like Dad. Always with the lectures about integrity and responsibility, while simultaneously handing me everything on a silver platter. The hypocrisy is staggering. The assessment contained enough truth to sting. Eleanor and Richard had indeed sent mixed messages throughout Alexander's upbringing, verbalizing values of hard work and responsibility while simultaneously removing obstacles and providing advantages that insulated him from genuine struggle. You're right, she acknowledged, surprising him visibly. We did you a disservice by cushioning you from the natural consequences of your choices. That inconsistency ends now. Alexander stared at her, clearly unprepared for agreement rather than defensiveness. So you admit you're being hypocritical? I admit we were inconsistent in the past, Eleanor clarified. My current actions are aligning my behavior with my values, creating consistency rather than contradiction. The distinction seemed to confuse Alexander, whose worldview didn't easily accommodate ethical evolution or principled correction. People were either useful to his purposes or obstacles to be overcome, their motivations relevant only insofar as they could be leveraged or neutralized. I need that money, Mother, he said finally, dropping pretense entirely. Everything's collapsing. The firm's cutting bonuses. The property taxes on the condo are past due. My credit cards are maxed out. What you need, Eleanor replied, is to reevaluate your priorities. To recognize that your current circumstances result from choices you've made consistently over decades. To consider that perhaps your father and I were right about delaying full access to the trust until you developed greater financial maturity. Alexander's expression darkened. So this is some twisted teaching moment? Watching your son struggle while you hand his inheritance to strangers? Olivia isn't a stranger, Eleanor pointed out. She's the woman you chose to marry, then abandoned on your wedding night for a speculative real estate venture. And the trust isn't being used for her personal benefit, it's funding educational opportunities for children who have never had the advantages you've taken for granted your entire life. The truth of these statements seemed to land more forcefully than Eleanor had anticipated. Alexander stepped back slightly, his rehearsed arguments momentarily derailed by direct confrontation with reality. "I made a mistake with Olivia," he admitted, the concession clearly calculated to demonstrate growth. "I was under tremendous pressure with the Aspen opportunity. I handled things poorly." "You called me worthless," Eleanor reminded him quietly. "At your wedding reception. When I declined to circumvent your father's carefully considered trust provisions." Alexander had the grace to look uncomfortable, though whether from genuine remorse or strategic disadvantage was unclear. "I was drunk. Stressed. You know I didn't mean it." "I think you did," Eleanor replied with the calm certainty of someone who had moved beyond the need for denial. "In that moment, you expressed your honest assessment of my value, measured solely by my willingness to provide what you wanted, when you wanted it, regardless of the terms your father and I had established." The accuracy of this interpretation seemed to momentarily stun Alexander. He opened his mouth to object, then closed it again, recognition flickering briefly across his features. "I would like you to leave now," Eleanor continued. "It's late, and this conversation isn't productive. If you'd like to discuss rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms, I'm open to that discussion, during daylight hours, when you're sober and prepared for honest reflection." "That's it?" Alexander demanded, his momentary insight already fading beneath renewed entitlement. "You're just going to send me away? After everything that's happening to me?" "Everything that's happening to you," Eleanor emphasized gently, "is the natural result of choices you've made. I can't protect you from those consequences anymore, Alexander. Nor should I." As she closed the door, she heard his final angry words, "This isn't over. You haven't seen the last of this fight." Eleanor leaned against the closed door, her heart racing despite her outward composure. The confrontation had been inevitable, she supposed. Alexander had never accepted limits or boundaries without testing them repeatedly, searching for weaknesses or exceptions that might apply to him. Yet something felt different about this encounter. Beneath the familiar manipulation and entitlement, she had glimpsed genuine distress, not just strategic performance but authentic recognition that his carefully constructed reality was collapsing around him. Eleanor moved through the quiet house, turning off lights and locking doors with methodical attention. As she passed Richard's study, she paused, drawn by some indefinable pull toward the space where they had made so many important decisions together. The moonlight filtering through the windows illuminated his desk, where a framed photograph stood, Eleanor and Richard on their wedding day, young and radiant with possibility, unaware of the challenges and triumphs that lay ahead. She picked it up, studying their expressions with the perspective that only decades could provide. "We did our best," she murmured to Richard's smiling image. "We made mistakes. But we're learning still." The house settled around her, creaking gently as old houses do, adjusting to temperature changes and the weight of memories. Eleanor replaced the photograph and continued to her bedroom, surprisingly at peace despite the emotional turbulence of the evening. Alexander's path forward remained his to determine. He could continue fighting the inevitable, expending energy and resources on battles already decided, or he could begin the harder work of genuine recalibration, adjusting his expectations to align with reality rather than demanding reality conform to his expectations. Either way, Eleanor had found her own direction. Not merely Richard's widow or Alexander's mother, but a woman of purpose and principle, using the resources entrusted to her care to create opportunities that would outlast her lifetime. Worthless, Alexander had called her. But worth wasn't measured in compliance with unreasonable demands or sacrifice of principle for temporary peace. True value emerged from alignment between values and actions, from choices that honored deeper truths rather than superficial expectations. As she drifted toward sleep, Eleanor's thoughts turned to the children she had met that evening, their bright faces animated with discovery, their minds expanding beyond previously imagined limitations. Marisol with her water filtration system, Jamal with his urban garden design, Destiny with her alternative energy demonstration. These were the true inheritors of Richard's legacy, not receiving his name or his DNA, but embodying the curiosity, innovation, and service that had defined his life's work. Through them, and through the expanding circles of impact their opportunities would create, something meaningful continued. Not an ending, Eleanor realized as sleep finally claimed her, but a transformation. Not loss, but legacy reimagined. Not worthlessness, but value redirected toward its highest purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, Alexander's continued. Resistance, the school board's expansion proposal, the evolving relationships forming in the wake of difficult decisions. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of the home she had once shared with Richard, Eleanor Blackwell rested in the certainty that courage eventually finds its own rewards, that principled choices create foundations for flourishing beyond what comfort or convenience could ever provide. Worth, properly understood, wasn't determined by others' assessment but by alignment with one's deepest values. By that measure, the only one that ultimately mattered, Eleanor had never been more valuable than in this season of difficult truth and purposeful redirection. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.